So a lot of this takes some of the stuff that Erica just talked about building that brand and such on social, and thinking about how you can expand that to an even greater reach, right? When you think about building a global community, you start to have to think beyond just how you perceive the world, but how others are perceiving your community and the world around you as well. So oftentimes it starts with you have the external community, people who are, all over the world. And then you have the internal organization. And if the two, aren't sort of working together hand in hand, then seeing it grow into a global community will be very difficult, because the internal needs to understand the external. So I want to walk you through two sides. What you must think about from the global community perspective, and also what you must think about from the internal management of that. So first off, let me walk through those global community must-haves. So first off, you may think, okay, so we want to get into all these different countries. Clearly, we need to, have everything translated. And that may not necessarily be the case, right? When you think about going into different locales, different areas, just thinking about translation, because translation is often a one-to-one, but it doesn't take on the meaning. It doesn't take on culture, right? It doesn't take on thinking about how each locale is actually unique and totally different. You may not have to translate. Your community may speak the same language that you do, right? It may be perfectly fine to have most of your material in English. However, you may find that instead of having, you may not see a ton of information or collaboration happening online, because people prefer to actually meet in person or that sort of thing, right? So depending on the culture and actually what fits there. So the other thing, Erica just mentioned, sorry, just lost my train of thought. So from the community side, right? Thinking about, as you're growing this community, you start actually thinking, okay, so how do things work in this country, in this region, in this area, right? And you start to think, okay, how am I going to then make sure that from the internal side that we actually have things covered, so that we can actually manage a community that is around the world, right? Because just building the community isn't enough. You have to be able to manage it on your side as well. So Erica had mentioned the accountability and ownership of the voice, right? But think about that across the globe. You have you may have multiple people running, managing the community. That accountability and ownership needs to be on any person who's on the front lines, whether they're answering social questions, they're publishing content, they are responding to forum inquiries, any of that, right? They need to have the ability to make a quick decision and know what comes next. Some of that does come with those voice and brand guidelines, right? That specifically that Erica mentioned. But you can use these for more than social. You can take these, and you can also say, perhaps you say in certain locales, you're fine speaking in English and using those, the same humor and colloquialisms might work just fine. But you may also find that in some areas, for example, it might not work. For example, one time I gave a presentation in Sydney, in Australia, and I had given the presentation before in the US, and it was all about how social media and SEO work together like peanut butter and jelly. Well, apparently in Australia, they don't eat peanut butter and jelly, right? And so I completely lost, from the get-go, people had a hard time paying attention just because I clearly hadn't localized and put together the idea that that I knew where I was going to be, and I knew what they cared about and what they knew about, right? I hadn't thought that far ahead. So utilizing the voice and guidelines as you not only cross languages, but cross culture and such is key. The other thing is being able to actually have coverage across those time zones. In some cases, you may have people who, you know, can also speak those languages, but being able to have cover more than one time zone will be key to building that global community. And the transparency of tasks. This, I like to think of it as passing the baton. So, for example, if, you know, someone in Europe is handling a situation, but it's not completely handled by the time they, you know, log out for the day and they go home, you need somebody who's in the US, who's essentially the next time zone, right, to be able to take that task and continue with it. So being able to have an open process that allows you to, you know, jump into items no matter what locale, no matter what time zone you're in, is important as well. Some of the tools that I have used both at Moz and at Welocalize that really helps some of this happen is Skype. Skype is wonderful, right? You can have a quick call with someone and say, okay, I just had this situation. Maybe it's at the end of each shift, there's a 10-minute touch point call that talks through things, right? Trello is really great for managing projects and tasks as they're happening. Slack allows you to have real-time conversations in various teams. I know one thing that was very helpful at Moz, for example, is we would have a Slack team for the customer service department. And so if a question came in that was more customer service focused, we could quickly ask the question, come back into our Slack and, you know, answer that question. And then Dropbox, of course, being able to share files and keep on board with that. So being able to have that follow through and collaboration as you are essentially passing the baton through time zones and such is imperative. So since we only have 10 minutes, I wanted to also have this quick checklist for each item. So the external community must-haves to think about: localization, whether you need language support, knowing and understanding the culture, realizing that colloquialisms and humor don't always translate. So, you know, you may think about that when you have your next campaign that is a back-to-school campaign, right? Because you're having a back-to-school campaign in the US. However, the rest of the world, maybe they call it something different, or maybe they're on different time, you know, they're not going back to school at that time, that sort of thing. So you need to think about how you're running those campaigns. The user experience. For example, there are certain languages that we found in the localization world at Welocalize that like to have things personal. They want to be able to call or email somebody. They don't want to have an online process that walks them through, you know, translating a document. They want to be able to talk to a person. Being able to have mobile experience, and then having help documentation that is customized to the language as well. Then for internal management on how you are going to manage those things, right? Having the accountability and ownership to make decisions, and no matter who you are, no matter the junior, you know, the levels, junior, senior, whatever. Building that voice and brand guide that will go along with social, what Erica talked about. Having rules and guidelines set up, transparency of tasks, utilizing whatever, you know, tools that you can find that are best for your team and collaboration, so you can have that great time zone support. And those are my top tips for building a global community. And I look forward to taking some questions and talking a bit more about it here in a bit.